It was upon a bleak November morning, the fog so dense it clung to the very panes of our sitting-room windows at 221B Baker Street, that my old friend Sherlock Holmes received a most peculiar visitor. The coals in our grate burned low, and Holmes, stretched languidly across the sofa in his dressing gown, had just concluded a monograph on the scratches made by various makes of pocket watches on trouser linings. I, meanwhile, had been leafing through the Times, catching only glimpses of headlines through the London mist that seeped into even the best-kept homes. There came a hesitant knock, 2 raps, a pause and a third, as though the knocker were unsure of their welcome. Holmes did not stir, but his eyes flashed open and turned toward the door. "That, Watson, is not Lestrade, nor is it a client with a straightforward grievance." I raised an eyebrow. "And how, pray, do you deduce that?" "Too cautious, too uncertain. Scotland Yard always enters with bluster, and the desperate pound like devils on Judgment Day. This, I should think, is a man unaccustomed to asking for help, perhaps even afraid of the implications of doing so. Our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, ushered in a tall gentleman wrapped in an immaculate black overcoat, his moustache heavy and military in cut. He carried a bowler in one gloved hand and in the other a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Holmes," the man began, his voice a clipped baritone, "I apologize for calling so early. My name is Colonel Archibald Addleton, late of the Royal Engineers. I've come because of a matter most unusual." Holmes gestured toward the armchair opposite him. "Colonel Addleton, please. Make yourself comfortable. You are recently retired, though only reluctantly, and you have not come here merely to report a theft." The colonel stiffened slightly but said nothing. Holmes continued, "The left cuff of your overcoat bears fresh scuffing from contact with stone, likely the edge of a desk or writing table. The paper parcel in your hand is too carefully wrapped to hold something of value, which leads me to believe it is the object at the center of your distress. And the expression you wear, sir, is not that of a man afraid of loss, but of meaning. Something has occurred which defies reason." The colonel's mouth fell open slightly. "Good Lord, they said you were remarkable, but—" "What happened, Colonel?" I interrupted gently, for I had seen the man's fingers twitch slightly around the parcel. He placed it carefully on the table. "It's a clock, Doctor. A carriage clock, to be precise. A gift to my late wife from the Maharaja of Ranipur when we lived in India. She kept it in her private study. The clock has never left our home until now." "And what has it done?" Holmes asked, sitting upright with sudden interest, "to warrant your visit?" "It struck 13, Mr. Holmes," Addleton said flatly. "At 1 o'clock in the morning. There was a brief silence. Even the fire seemed to retreat. I heard it with my own ears, as did my housekeeper and my valet. I had been dozing in the drawing-room, and had left the study door open. When the clock struck 1, it struck once, then again, then a third time, and so on, until it had chimed 13 times." Holmes rose to his feet. "You are certain it was not a mechanical fault? A misalignment of the internal ratchet or mainspring? I had it examined the next morning by my clockmaker. He says the device is in perfect working order. And stranger still, last night it did the same. At precisely 1 o'clock, I leaned forward." "Twice in 2 nights?" Addleton nodded, and on both occasions it was followed by something else. "The first night, a framed photograph of my wife was found shattered upon the floor of her study, though there was no sign of disturbance. Last night, one of the drawers in her desk was found open. Locked, I assure you, and untouched for months." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Colonel, forgive the bluntness, but is there anyone in the house who might wish to frighten you?" "I live alone now, save for a cook, a housekeeper and a valet who's been with me since India." "I trust them implicitly. And where is this house?" "Richmond Hill, number 17, Everdon Crescent." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I think it would be prudent to postpone your luncheon with your publisher." "I'd already intended to cancel," I replied, reaching for my coat. "Good. Colonel Addleton, you may return to your home. We shall join you this evening." The colonel hesitated. "Then you do believe me?" "I believe," Holmes said softly, turning the parcel over in his hands, "that a clock that strikes 13 is not a malfunction. It is a message. And the man who sends such a message rarely does so without intent." As Addleton took his leave, the last chime of a far-off church bell echoed through the fog, muffled by distance but not without portent. Holmes stared at the clock now resting on our table. "Tell me, Watson," he mused, "what is more terrifying to the rational man, a crime committed in cold blood, or a logic that bends time itself?" I made no reply, for though I had seen Holmes face down killers, blackmailers, and even the great Moriarty himself, something in the air felt different that morning, something old and unsettling, like the unnatural sound of a clock that dares to strike when it ought not to. It was nearing 4:30 when we arrived at Everton Crescent, the thick November dusk already gathering like a shroud about the grand Georgian townhouses that lined the quiet avenue. Number 17 stood at the corner, a stately home with ivy creeping up one side, and a wrought-iron gate that groaned softly as we passed through. Colonel Addleton himself received us at the door, his face a touch paler than that morning, though he wore the same disciplined posture of an officer, unaccustomed to showing unease. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, stepping aside to admit us. "Thank you for coming. I confess I've felt watched somehow since we spoke." Holmes offered no reassurance. He seldom did. Instead, he surveyed the entrance hall with keen interest, his eyes flitting from the coat stand, with its military-issue greatcoat to the umbrella, with faint traces of red clay on its ferrule. "I presume the clock remains in your late wife's study?" Holmes asked. "Precisely as it was this morning." "Then that is where we shall begin." We followed Addleton through a wide corridor panelled in dark oak. A few portraits lined the walls, some military, some domestic, and each bore the mark of careful maintenance. We were led into a study of moderate size and elegant austerity. A fire crackled weakly in the grate, and upon the mantelpiece, resting beneath a glass dome, stood the clock in question. It was a beautiful object, French-made, no doubt, with ormolu flourishes and a porcelain face, upon which Roman numerals were painted with delicate precision. Holmes removed the dome with the delicacy of a museum curator and knelt before the clock, drawing from his coat a jeweller's loop and a pair of long silver-tipped tweezers. "May I ask, Colonel," Holmes said without looking up, "do you wind the clock yourself?" "No," said the Colonel. "It is wound each Saturday by my valet Hargrove." "And had it ever behaved unusually before this week?" Our footsteps echoed softly against the wet pavement as Holmes paused before the wrought-iron gate. Glancing once more at the cryptic note that had so unsettled us, "The rose blooms where the shadow falls," he pocketed it with a steady hand. "Observe." "Watson," he said quietly, "the message is no mere flourish. The rose is a symbol of concealment and revelation, like the hidden compartment in the clock. Where the shadow falls suggests a place cloaked in darkness, both literal and metaphorical." I nodded, though the weight of his meaning pressed heavily upon me. Holmes pressed the bell, the chime faint yet distinct, then stepped back into the shrouding mist. The door opened to reveal a man of middle age, dressed plainly but with a certain wary sharpness in his eyes. "Yes?" the man asked. Holmes introduced himself simply. "Sherlock Holmes. May I come in? I believe you have information pertaining to the Addleton affair." The man studied us for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in, then. But be warned, you tread on dangerous ground." Inside, the room was sparsely furnished but meticulously kept, the scent of tobacco and ink lingering in the air. The man introduced himself as Thomas Crane, a clockmaker of some repute, though he disclaimed any direct connection to the Gavin Rook who had orchestrated the intrusion at Everton Crescent. "What do you know of Mr. Rook?" Holmes asked, settling into a worn leather chair. Crane hesitated, then spoke in low tones. "Rook is a ghost, a name used by a network of operatives hired by powerful interests. I refuse to work for such people, but I know that the altered clock was crafted in my old workshop, stolen in the night after I refused to participate." Holmes leaned forward. "Why involve you if you had no intention to cooperate?" Crane's eyes flickered with unease. "They had leverage, a threat against my family. That's why the clock was altered, to signal an imminent theft. They needed it to strike 13 to mark the hour when the deed should be done." Holmes nodded slowly. "A cruel kind of blackmail. And the note? The rose blooms where the shadow falls?" Crane glanced toward the curtained window. "It's a reference to a meeting place, an old pub nearby called the Shadowed Rose. That's where they coordinate." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then our next step is clear. Watson, prepare yourself." We left Crane's home and crossed the fog-laden streets to a narrow alleyway where a modest sign creaked above a doorway. The Shadowed Rose. Inside, the dim light and thick air were redolent with secrets. Holmes's eyes scanned the room, men and women seated at tables, whispering in hushed tones, shadows folding over them like a shroud. We approached the bar, and Holmes ordered 2 whiskies, his manner unassuming but alert. From a corner, a figure detached itself and approached, a woman with sharp eyes and a guarded smile. "You seek Rook," she said softly. "But he is careful, very careful." Holmes fixed her with a piercing gaze. "Then perhaps you can tell me where he will strike next." She hesitated, then nodded. "The real target is not the charter, but those who possess it. You, Miss Carmichael, and Colonel Addleton." Before Holmes could respond, the door burst open. Men in dark coats flooded the room, their eyes glinting with menace. The trap had sprung. Holmes and I rose swiftly, hands at the ready. The woman shouted a warning, and chaos erupted. A swift melee beneath the low ceilings. Holmes's fists were lightning quick, knocking a man into a table. I fired a warning shot that scattered the assailants momentarily. In the confusion, Holmes gestured toward a back door. "Now, Watson." We dashed through the narrow passage behind the bar, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. Emerging into the cold night, we sprinted toward the waiting hansom, the fog swallowing our figures as we vanished into the labyrinth of London streets. Breathless, we paused in a quiet square. Holmes's gaze was fierce, his mind already racing ahead. "They will not give up so easily, Watson, but we have the advantage of knowledge and time. The clock has struck 13, and the game is entering its final hours." I nodded, heart pounding not only from the chase, but from the certainty that in this city of shadows and whispers, the truth would emerge, striking at last like the steady, inexorable chime of a clock that refuses to be silenced. As the hansom rattled away through the serpentine alleys of London, Holmes's keen gaze remained fixed ahead, calculating, passing the events of the night with the precision of a master clockmaker. The narrow escape from the Shadowed Rose had revealed the depth and desperation of our adversaries, men who would stop at nothing to secure the charter and silence those who protected it once safely. Ensconced back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. "Watson," he said, "the pieces fall into place with a certainty both thrilling and terrible. We have the document, the players, and the clues. Yet the true question remains, what is the final act they seek to perform?" I observed as he spread out the various letters, sketches and notes upon the table, each a thread weaving toward the intricate tapestry of the case. His fingers traced the outline of the forged charter once more. "The Maharaja's charter," Holmes mused, "is not merely a contract of land. It is a key that opens doors to wealth, influence, and dominion in the British Empire's shadowed reaches. Our opponents know this, and they have calculated every move to claim that power." Nalini Bose's testimony about the second charter being entrusted to Marion Addleton confirmed the double-edged nature of the document. Meanwhile, the threat notes and the altered clock chiming 13 had been carefully designed to unsettle and distract. Yet it was the last failed attempt at the Shadowed Rose that revealed the true peril. The hunt was now for the keepers of the secret. Holmes turned to me with a grim smile. "I suspect that the mastermind is closer than we think. Possibly someone with access to the Addleton household, or perhaps someone hiding behind a respectable facade in London's elite circles." Our conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, delivered only moments before. Holmes took it and scanned the brief message, his brow furrowing. "Watson, read this," he instructed. I read aloud. "Colonel Addleton attacked last night at Everton Crescent. Injured but stable. Suspected attempt to seize charter. Police investigating." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Our enemies have grown bolder. This is no longer a game of shadows. It is a war waged in broad daylight." We hurried to the colonel's residence, where the atmosphere was tense and heavy. Addleton lay in his study, bandaged but alert, his face pale yet determined. "They came for the charter," he said hoarsely. "Masked men broke into the house. I resisted, but they were numerous." Estelle Carmichael paced nearby, her face a mask of worry and resolve. "If they believe we possess the original, we must act quickly." Holmes surveyed the room thoughtfully. "We must assume the original charter is still hidden. Somewhere your wife secured it beyond reach." He turned to the housekeeper, Mrs. Bletchley. "Have any new disturbances been noticed?" "Changes in routine," Strangers lurking. The older woman shook her head. Nothing unusual, sir, except last night's commotion. I heard voices, hurried footsteps. But no one saw faces. Holmes's mind raced as he pieced together the night's grim puzzle. They want the charter. They want control. But they underestimate our resolve and their own recklessness. That night, as London's fog curled like smoke through the streets, Holmes and I conferred over every detail. The clock, the notes, the assaults. Each event was a tick marking the countdown to a climax only he could foresee. Finally, Holmes rose, his eyes gleaming with resolve. Watson, tomorrow we will return to Everton Crescent for a final search. There is one place we have not yet examined, a secret chamber, concealed behind a false panel in the library. Marian's last safeguard. The search was arduous, but late into the night behind a sliding bookshelf, Holmes discovered a narrow passageway leading to a small hidden chamber. There, resting on a velvet cushion, lay a leather-bound ledger, the true Rose Ledger, containing the original charter and Marian's meticulous annotations. Holmes held the ledger aloft. This is the prize, the heart of the mystery. As dawn broke over London, the police moved swiftly to secure the residence and arrest those implicated in the conspiracy. Holmes turned to me with a rare smile. Once again, Watson, justice is measured not in the passage of time, but in the patience of its pursuers. I knew then that the clock had finally struck true. Justice was served at last, with the steady precision only Holmes could command. As morning's pale light filtered through the heavy drapes of Everton Crescent, the tension in the house had all but dissipated, replaced by a sober sense of relief and the quiet dignity of victory. The original charter, the elusive Rose Ledger, lay secure in Holmes's hands, a testament to patience, perseverance, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. I watched as Holmes meticulously examined the aged leather volume, his keen eyes scanning the intricate script penned by Marian Addleton herself. The ledger contained not only legal transcriptions, but also notes of alliances, warnings, and encrypted references to distant lands, a chronicle that had been sought with deadly intent. Colonel Addleton, though still recovering from the recent attack, stood near the window, gazing outward, with a mix of gratitude and somber reflection. Estelle Carmichael remained close, her presence a quiet comfort, as was Nalini Bose, the Maharaja's loyal secretary, whose steadfast resolve had proved invaluable. The door swung open slowly, revealing a shadowed figure. He stepped inside cautiously, clad in dark clothing, face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The man's movements were deliberate, measured, the hallmarks of a practiced infiltrator. Holmes advanced without hesitation, voice low but commanding. Gavin Rook, or whatever name you assume, your time has run out. The man froze, then reached inside his coat. I raised the revolver, heart pounding, as Holmes closed the distance in 2 strides. A sudden flash and a silver glint from the man's hand, and a sharp hiss escaped his lips as he lunged. Holmes parried, twisting aside the blade with practiced ease, then landed a crushing blow to the assailant's ribs. The man staggered but did not fall. With a roar he charged again, this time striking with a length of heavy wire he'd whipped free from his sleeve. The wire lashed out, grazing Holmes's arm and coiling around his wrist. "Watson!" Holmes barked. "Cut it!" I rushed forward, knife flashing in the dim light, severing the wire. Holmes twisted free and delivered a precise strike to the man's temple, sending him crashing to the floor in a heap. Breathing heavily, Holmes crouched beside the captive. "You've done a poor job of hiding your true identity. The clock's chime was your signal, but it was also your undoing." The man's eyes fluttered open, pain and defiance mingling within their depths. "You don't understand," he rasped. "The charter belongs to those who paid for it, not the crown." Holmes shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "And yet it is you who will answer for your crime." As the constables arrived moments later to take the man into custody, Holmes turned to the assembled group. The man we faced was a hired agent, dispatched by forces seeking to erase history for personal gain. The clock's alteration was his calling card, a cruel and clever ruse designed to unsettle and distract. He glanced at the forged document still resting on the desk. "But our replica will buy us time. Time to alert the authorities in India to the theft of the original charter, and to begin the legal battle to preserve what remains." Estelle exhaled, the tension visibly draining from her shoulders. "The truth at last," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gave a rare, modest nod. "The truth is a delicate mechanism, Miss Carmichael. One that demands patience, precision, and care." As the house settled into quiet once more, I looked out the window into the London fog, that age-old veil of mystery. I realized then, as I had countless times before, that in the hands of Sherlock Holmes, even the most tangled puzzles could be unraveled, one carefully struck chime at a time. And thus ended the curious case of the clock that struck 13. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, with the promise of rain, the usual London fog still pressing close upon the windows of 221B Baker Street. Holmes and I sat quietly in our familiar sitting room, the weight of the previous night's events settling into a contemplative stillness between us. The parcel containing the forged charter lay unopened on the table, its very presence a reminder of the delicate balance we had struck between exposure and concealment. Holmes reclined in his favourite armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire. At last he spoke, his voice a mixture of triumph and sober reflection. "The man we apprehended yesterday was but one thread in a far larger tapestry, Watson. Though the immediate threat has been contained, the true adversaries, the puppet masters behind this plot, remain at large, their motives entwined with the very fabric of empire and commerce." I leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you believe the charter's theft was politically motivated, then? Some colonial intrigue?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed. The Maharaja's lands represent not only vast wealth, but also strategic influence. The disappearance of the original charter from the estate in India, coupled with the attempts to suppress its duplicate here in London, point to an effort to rewrite ownership, to place the land beyond challenge and scrutiny." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the window. Our intercepted intruder was a hired hand, a sword swung by unseen masters who believe history can be edited with forged documents and whispered threats. But they have underestimated the resilience of those who guard the truth and the vigilance of those who refuse to let it fade into silence. Holmes's words carried a quiet gravity, but beneath it lay the familiar fire of resolve that had driven him through countless perils. "Colonel Addleton and Miss Carmichael," he continued, "have agreed to cooperate fully with the legal authorities, providing testimony and evidence that will undoubtedly delay, if not derail, any fraudulent claims. Meanwhile, the forged charter remains a tool, one to draw out the remaining conspirators or force their retreat." I considered this carefully. "And the clock?" Holmes smiled faintly. "A symbol, Watson. A reminder that time itself can be manipulated by those who would rewrite history, by those who seek power through deceit. But time, like truth, has a way of asserting itself, striking when least expected." Our conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a small card on a silver tray. "Mr. Holmes, this arrived just now." "No courier, no mark, only your name in a familiar hand." Holmes took the card and examined it. On the surface was inscribed a single line, "The rose blooms where the shadow falls." A chill ran down my spine. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Watson, the game is not yet over." He rose abruptly, donning his coat and hat. "There are messages here hidden in riddles and cryptic notes. The phrase 'where the shadow falls' suggests a place or person still concealed." We moved quickly to the study, where Holmes carefully examined the clock once more. His hands moved with expert care, lifting the glass dome, inspecting the intricate mechanism beneath. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The clock was not only altered to strike 13, it was designed with a hidden compartment beneath the face, a secret cavity large enough to conceal small items, perhaps a key or documents." He produced a slender metal key from within the mechanism, holding it aloft. "This," he said, "is the literal key to the mystery." Holmes retrieved the torn envelope we had found earlier, carefully unfolding the slip of paper with the ominous instruction, "Ask not who strikes the hour, but who resets the time." "I believe," Holmes said, "that the true mastermind has yet to reveal themselves. They have watched us closely, moved their pawns carefully, and now leave us this final clue, a summons perhaps, or a threat." We paused as the clock chimed softly in the afternoon stillness, its deep notes marking the passage of hours and a moment in time that felt charged with portent. "Watson," Holmes said, turning to me, "prepare yourself. This investigation is about to enter its most dangerous phase. And with that, he stepped into the foggy London streets once more, determination burning bright in his eyes. As I followed, I understood with certainty that the shadows would soon give way to revelations, and that the clock's final strike would not merely end the tale but reveal the hidden hand that had set it all in motion. The evening descended like a velvet curtain over the city, thick with fog that swirled about gaslights and muffled the usual clatter of London streets. Holmes and I strode purposefully toward a modest townhouse in Soho, a district far removed from the aristocratic calm of Everton Crescent, but no less vital to the tangled web we sought to unravel. The address had been discreetly provided by Nalini Bose after her recent arrival, a place she had implicated as a nexus for the shadowy network pursuing the charter. "Now the balance tips," he murmured. "Show her in." As the door opened and a woman in a dark travelling coat stepped inside, her features obscured by a thin veil, Holmes turned to us with a quiet, almost reverent smile. "At last," he said. "The final player has stepped onto the board," and somewhere, as if it had been waiting, the clock gave a final chime, not a 13th, not unnatural, but a single ordinary note. Yet its sound rang through the house like a bell of judgment. The woman who entered the drawing room of 17 Everton Crescent stood with quiet poise, her veil casting a thin shadow over her face, though it could not obscure the firmness of her stance, nor the measured dignity in her voice. "My name is Nalini Bose," she said calmly. "I served as secretary to the late Maharaja of Ranipur for 8 years. I was told by an anonymous note that the charter had resurfaced. I came to verify it and to protect it." Holmes extended a hand in welcome, his eyes narrowing with sharp interest. "Miss Bose, your timing is either impeccable or precisely orchestrated. Please tell us how you knew the document had reappeared." She stepped further into the room and removed her gloves, revealing long, nimble fingers. "I received a plain envelope by private courier at my lodgings in Bloomsbury this morning. No return address. It contained one sentence: 'The Rose has opened Everton Crescent.' I took it to mean that the charter, what we called the Rose Ledger, had been found." Addleton, standing by the fireplace, looked from Holmes to Nalini with open bewilderment. "Forgive my bluntness, Miss Bose, but how is it that you are involved in this matter at all? Why should a document, apparently left in my wife's care, concern you?" She turned to face him. "Because your wife and I were both entrusted with its preservation. The Maharaja of Ranipur, fearing the future political upheavals, drew up 2 identical charters. One was held in his archives. The other he gave to his confidant, Marian Addleton. Estelle, who had remained silent since the capture of the intruder, now leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why? Why give it to her?" Nalini's gaze softened. "Because he trusted her, and because she had leverage of her own. Your cousin Marian was not merely a guest in his court. She had influence through her husband's connections, yes, but also through her own intelligence and negotiation skills. When unrest began to stir among the Maharaja's advisors, she advised him to secure his agreement through multiple hands. And this charter," Holmes interjected, retrieving the document from his coat, "was one of those hands. But the existence of a second copy means your life may now be in danger as well." "I am well aware," Nalini replied. "That is why I left India. The original charter vanished 2 months ago from the Maharaja's estate. When I realized it had been stolen, I feared the duplicate would be next." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we are dealing with professionals who understood both the document's existence and its value. The man we intercepted tonight was but an instrument. The true mind behind this plot remains hidden, and no doubt now agitated by his failure." He turned suddenly to the colonel. "Addleton, have you noticed any recent inquiries, letters, callers, asking about your late wife's possessions? Anyone feigning interest in personal artifacts, furnishings, correspondence?" The colonel considered, then frowned. 2 weeks ago, a man inquired by letter about a supposed art appraisal. Said he'd heard Marian had collected antique clocks. He asked whether we'd be willing to loan one for an upcoming exhibition. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A common ruse. Did you respond?" "No, I thought it odd and ignored it. Do you still have the letter?" "Yes, I believe Mrs. Bletchley kept it." Holmes rang the bell, and a moment later the housekeeper appeared, eyes wide with the lingering tension of the evening's events. She fetched a file folder from the writing desk and handed it over. Holmes extracted the envelope in question. The letterhead was bland, the handwriting neat. Almost too neat, practiced, deliberate. Holmes scanned it swiftly. Signed by one Gavin Rook, curator of horological antiquities. A fictitious title if ever I've read one. But this name, I believe, may yet lead us to the real clockmaker of this plot. He turned to Estelle. Miss Carmichael, do you recall anyone else during your stay, perhaps a tradesman or neighbour, who seemed unusually interested in the clock or in your late cousin's habits? Estelle hesitated. There was a man, tall, fair-haired. He claimed to be from the gasworks. Said there had been a pressure-reading discrepancy in our block. He came twice. I never saw a uniform or credentials, and he spent far too long near the study for my liking. I asked him to leave on the second visit. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. I believe we now have a shape forming, a figure behind the curtain, so to speak. He paced the floor slowly, his voice growing more deliberate. Let us collect the facts as we know them. Marian Addleton possessed a duplicate of a politically sensitive land charter, entrusted to her by the Maharaja. She hid it inside her home, possibly fearing its theft. Before her death, she left a coded warning, the clock chimes, as a signal that the charter had been found or tampered with. Estelle, tipped off by that signal, returned to the house. In the meantime, a false appraiser reached out, seeking access to the clock under false pretenses. Hey, burglar, skilled, silent and armed, entered during the signal's second strike, likely instructed to retrieve the charter and remove any witnesses. He looked up at us all. The next move, however, will not be so subtle. The failed attempt tonight will provoke escalation. The person behind this, Gavin Rook or whoever hides beneath that name, will not wait much longer. Addleton spoke gravely. Then what must we do? Holmes stepped to the clock on the mantel and turned its hands forward slowly, listening to the internal click of the gearing. We will give them what they want, he said. Estelle's head snapped up. You mean the charter? No, Holmes said. A forgery. Close enough to draw them out. We must force the hand of the man behind the clock's design. He believes he is operating in secret, but a man who resets time can only do so from outside the room. We will let him in and trap him inside. Nalini looked at Holmes, her voice calm but wary. And who will take the forgery to him? Holmes smiled faintly. I will. He looked at Watson. And you, my dear friend, will watch my back. I nodded without hesitation. A long pause followed, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls as the clock ticked, steady and indifferent in the background. Then Holmes spoke again, voice low and precise. Tonight we let the 13th chime strike once more, but this time it will not echo unanswered. The house was hushed beneath the heavy velvet drapes, the fading light outside swallowed almost entirely by the encroaching fog that London had so faithfully delivered for weeks. Holmes stood by the window of the drawing room, adjusting the folds of his cloak with meticulous care. The forged charter lay carefully folded on the polished surface of the writing desk, its paper crisp and unblemished, a convincing replica, fashioned with the precision of a skilled forger. Estelle, Nalini, and Colonel Addleton sat clustered together in the shadowed corner, their faces drawn with worry and weariness. I remained near Holmes, revolver concealed but close at hand, my senses alert for any hint of movement beyond the walls. Holmes turned from the window and fixed his piercing gaze upon us. Remember, this is no mere sting. We are engaging a man who thinks in gears and secrets, whose obsession with precision borders on the pathological. He believes himself to be the master of time, but time is a prisoner tonight. And we are its wardens. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour, one sharp, solemn note followed by the slow, deliberate toll of the 13 chimes. Each strike reverberated through the house like the heartbeat of a predator. Then came silence. The stillness was shattered moments later by the faintest of sounds, a soft click from the study door. Holmes was instantly at the threshold, his hand curling around the door handle like a steel trap. He exchanged a look with me, eyes conveying the silent command, "Be ready." I was told to expect them, years ago. My mother received a letter from Marian when she was still in India. It said that if anything ever happened to her, the signal would be the clock, the chime of 13, and you came to the Addleton house to recover what she left behind. I came because I was afraid, Estelle said. Marian knew something about a land agreement made between the Maharaja and the Crown. She never told me the full truth, only that she kept a copy of the charter. A copy that others might want destroyed. And so you searched the house while staying there? I asked. Yes, she said. I thought it might be hidden in her study. But I found nothing. When I heard the clock chime 13, I panicked. I thought someone else had found the secret before me. I left the next morning. Holmes studied her intently. But you were followed. And now you are being watched. Her eyes widened slightly. Yes, I thought it was my imagination at first. But I've noticed someone across the street, watching from the upper window of number 25. Not every day, but often enough that I began to dread the curtains parting. He moved to the window and parted the sheer drapes, peering discreetly out. There, he murmured. Upper left window closed, but a shadow behind the curtain. He turned suddenly. Miss Carmichael, you must come with us. You are no longer safe here, she hesitated. But the charter, what happens to it now? Holmes tucked the document into the inner pocket of his coat. That, Miss Carmichael, will be entrusted to the proper authorities. This agreement was not merely legal, it was dangerous. If what I suspect is true, this paper grants leverage over a considerable fortune, and someone, perhaps several, would kill to obtain it. She rose, her face pale but resolute. Then let us go. As we stepped outside into the heavy twilight, Holmes looked across the square once more. A faint shift in the curtain across the street confirmed his suspicions. He said nothing. He merely tightened his grip on the handle of his cane. The fog had begun to settle again, thicker now, swallowing the lamps before their light could fully escape. We moved quickly down the stone steps and into the street, Estelle between us. We must return to Everton Crescent, Holmes said lowly. The second chime is due tonight. Whoever orchestrated this, whoever reset the clock, is preparing to act again. And this time they will not settle for stolen parchment. I glanced back once. A figure stood now behind the parted curtain at number 25, tall, motionless and featureless in silhouette, watching, waiting. The clock would strike again. And this time Holmes would be ready. The cab ride back to Everton Crescent was shrouded in tension. Estelle sat between Holmes and myself, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white as though bracing herself for an impact she could neither see nor avoid. The fog was thickening now into a milky pall, blurring the gas lamps and muffling the sounds of hooves against the stone. Holmes remained alert yet silent, his fingers tracing the outline of the sealed charter in his coat pocket, as if its presence anchored the strategy forming in his mind. Holmes, I said in a low voice, if the second chime is meant to signal another step in this scheme, why return to the house? Wouldn't it be wiser to take Estelle to safety? He did not look at me as he replied, You are thinking like a soldier, Watson. I'm thinking like a watchmaker. He turned his head slightly, eyes sharp. Each movement in this plot has been calibrated, timed with precision. Someone has planned these intervals not merely to retrieve a document, but to stir panic, to test resolve, and now, I suspect, to silence witnesses. If we remove Miss Carmichael, the mechanism will adjust. The perpetrator may vanish altogether. No, we must let the chime strike, Watson. We must allow the trap to spring, and be ready with our own spring of steel. We arrived just before dusk, the house at Everton Crescent standing solemn in the fading light. Colonel Addleton received us at the door, his expression etched with fatigue and suspicion. When he saw Estelle, he frowned. She has a right to be here, Colonel, Holmes said without preamble, and her presence may well prevent bloodshed before the night is out. Addleton said nothing, merely stepped aside to allow us in. Mrs. Bletchley brought tea at Holmes's request, and the household gathered in the drawing-room. The Colonel, Estelle, myself, and Holmes, while Hargrove remained posted by the front door at Holmes's insistence. All windows had been locked. The gas lights were lowered. The house, it seemed, held its breath. Holmes stood by the mantelpiece watching the study door across the corridor. The French carriage clock sat where it always had, its elegant face turned outward, the minute hand now inching toward the top of the hour. We are minutes from the second chime, Holmes said, glancing toward me. Watson, I will need your service at the far end of the corridor. You will act as our fail-safe, should the intruder slip past. I nodded, checking the small revolver Holmes had earlier pressed into my hand. Colonel, Holmes continued, I will ask you to remain seated. Miss Carmichael, stay near me. No matter what you hear, no one is to move until I give the signal. There was a brief hush. Then the first chime struck. It echoed through the house with a rich, resonant tone that carried far beyond its modest volume, a sound that seemed to deepen the silence rather than disturb it. The second chime followed, a beat longer than it should have taken. A hesitation, deliberate and unnatural, and then footsteps, soft, precise, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably from upstairs. Holmes was moving before anyone could react, slipping across the hall with ghost-like swiftness, disappearing up the stairs as I took my position in the corridor. A moment later, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards overhead, then a cry, a strangled sound, followed by a sharp scuffle. I bounded up the stairs in time to see Holmes grappling with a figure dressed in black at the end of the hallway. The intruder was slight but quick, trying to twist free. Holmes caught a wrist, twisted it hard, and the figure collapsed to the ground with a gasp of pain. I raised the revolver but held fire. The struggle was already over. Holmes straightened, pulling back the black hood to reveal a pale face, half hidden beneath a shock of dark, damp hair. The man looked scarcely older than 25. His cheek was bruised, and in his belt we found a small knife, a coiled length of wire, and a folded note. Holmes opened it under the flickering hallway light. Retrieve the charter. Eliminate loose ends, disappear. The handwriting matched the earlier threat. Name? Holmes demanded. The man spat at the floor and turned his head away. I thought as much, Holmes muttered. Professional, hired, trained not to speak. Estelle and the colonel had followed us by now. She stared at the man in disbelief. I know him, she whispered. He came to the house once. Said he was from the solicitor's office, sent to retrieve signatures. He never gave a name. Holmes gave a tight nod. Not a solicitor, an agent. Sent to monitor the household and retrieve the charter, once Marian Addleton was out of the way. But they hadn't counted on her leaving instructions, or on the 13 chimes drawing attention. He turned to Addleton. Colonel, I must now ask, did you know of any arrangement made by your late wife with the Maharaja that might have legal consequences? Addleton, clearly rattled, looked away. She told me nothing. Only that she kept correspondence locked away, and that it was never to be opened except on her instructions. I honored that. Holmes moved back down the stairs, drawing us into the study once more. This case, he said slowly, is not about murder, though it may yet come to that. It is about erasure. The people behind this, whoever hired our silent visitor, are attempting to wipe out a transaction, to destroy a legal agreement that ties land and inheritance in India to British hands. That charter we found was not merely an artifact, it was leverage. He drew out the document again, holding it gently. And now that it's in our possession, someone will want to ensure it never sees a courtroom. Estelle sat quietly in the corner, her composure shaken but intact. You believe they'll try again? They will, Holmes said. But they'll do so carefully now. The signal has failed. The chime has been answered not with silence but with resistance. A soft knock interrupted us. Hargrove stood at the door, visibly shaken. Sir, there's someone else at the gate, a woman. Says she's from the Maharaja's former estate office. Name of Nalini Bose. Holmes's face shifted for the first time that evening, a flicker of something approaching surprise. I believe she returned to a residence in Knightsbridge, though we've not had contact in months. Holmes gave a sharp nod. Watson, take a look at this. He handed me the paper we'd recovered from Cadwell's lodgings. The cryptic line still made my skin prickle. Ask not who strikes the hour, but who resets the time. What do you make of it? He asked. It sounds allegorical, I said slowly. As though the one who sets events in motion remains unseen. The chimes are only the symptom. Exactly, Holmes said. Who reset the time, Watson? Who altered the clock? Not just to strike, but to strike when it must, twice in succession, each time triggering something within this house. Colonel Addleton looked troubled. What was taken from that box? I cannot say yet, Holmes replied. But we must assume that its contents were never meant to remain. I believe your wife left something behind, something hidden, something she feared others might seek. And you believe Estelle had something to do with it? I believe, Holmes said, that Miss Carmichael did not leave this house empty-handed. But if we are to confirm that, we must speak with her directly. Before we could depart, Mrs. Bletchley appeared with a silver tray bearing tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. Begging your pardon, Colonel, she said quietly, but I thought you'd like to see this. She handed Addleton a folded envelope, yellowed slightly, the seal already broken. I found it tucked behind the bottom drawer of the lady's desk while dusting. It must have slipped there unnoticed. Addressed to you, sir, in her hand. Addleton took it with astonishment and unfolded the letter. His eyes moved quickly over the lines, his breath catching halfway through. Holmes reached gently for the paper. "May I?" The colonel nodded mutely. Holmes read aloud. "My dear Archibald, if you are reading this, it means the box has been discovered, and perhaps so has the truth. I never told you everything. Before I met you, I made a grave error in judgment, one that followed me from India. The Maharaja's gift was not just a clock. It was a signal, an assurance that a secret remained kept. I dared not destroy the records, but I did hide them. If you ever hear that clock strike 13, know that it means someone has come seeking what they were promised. Trust no one, not even family. Estelle may not be who she claims. Forgive me. Yours always, Marion." Holmes folded the letter slowly, his brow furrowed. "Watson, do you recall the ledger entry from Cadwell's room? Unlocks the rose. We assumed it meant a person or a code name." "Yes," I said. "You suggested it could be metaphorical." "Or literal," Holmes murmured. "There is a variety of antique writing boxes known as rosières, roses, because they often feature floral marquetry and hidden compartments. If Marion Addleton possessed such a box, it could explain the mention, and if someone recovered it from the closet, then they now hold the only surviving record of whatever it was she feared." A knock at the door interrupted us. Hargrove entered, his face pale. "Sir," he said, addressing Addleton, "a letter has just been delivered by hand." No return address. The courier refused to name the sender. Holmes took the envelope before the colonel could move. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in the same angular hand we had seen in the schematic, was written, "Second chime tonight. You have until then to return what was taken, or the next to vanish will not be a clock." Holmes read it aloud, then looked up. "We are no longer dealing with threats hidden in drawers or whispers from clocks. Tonight someone intends to act again, decisively. And if we are to prevent it, we must find Estelle Carmichael before the second chime strikes." Without waiting for assent, Holmes turned toward the door. "To Knightsbridge, Watson." With haste. The cab carried us swiftly across the city, its wheels clattering over damp cobblestones as the early afternoon faded into the dim promise of another fog-heavy evening. Holmes sat rigid, his expression unreadable, save for the faint tick at the corner of his jaw that told me his mind was racing. He clutched the envelope containing both Marion Addleton's confession and the anonymous threat. The documents folded neatly, as though their paper weight alone could balance the scales of logic he now manipulated in his mind. "Holmes," I said at last, unable to contain the question that had been gnawing at me since we departed Everton Crescent, "what precisely do you suspect Miss Carmichael of? Theft, deception, murder?" Holmes did not immediately reply. He watched the streets unfurl past the cab window, his eyes distant. "I suspect," he said at last, "that Estelle Carmichael is not a simple relation. I suspect she has knowledge of what was hidden in that closet, perhaps knowledge of why the clock chimes as it does. I do not yet believe her a killer. But I do believe she was sent, or invited herself, into the colonel's home under false pretenses." I was about to press him further when the cab turned sharply into a residential square near Knightsbridge, a quiet crescent where tall white townhouses stood like upright chess pieces around a fenced garden. Holmes paid the driver, then led the way to number 29, where a polished brass plate bore the name Miss E. Carmichael. He did not knock immediately. Instead, he stepped back to survey the building. 3 stories, narrow but well kept, with curtains drawn tightly across each window. He reached out, knocked crisply, and waited. A young maid opened the door, clearly startled by our unannounced arrival. "Yes, sir?" "Miss Carmichael," Holmes said without flourish. "Is she at home?" I'm afraid she's just stepped out. To the post office, I believe." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then perhaps we might wait inside. It is a matter of some urgency, and I believe she would wish to receive us." The girl hesitated, clearly uncertain, but something in Holmes's tone left little room for argument. She led us into a modest front room decorated with delicate watercolors and a faint scent of lavender. Holmes made no pretense of sitting. The moment the maid vanished, he began to pace, examining the mantel, the writing desk, and a tall bookshelf stacked with novels and travel journals. It was the writing desk that held his attention longest. He bent over it, inspecting the blotter, opening a few drawers. One, when tugged, resisted with a faint click. "Locked," he muttered. "Watson, your penknife." I handed it to him without a word. With a deft movement, he slipped the blade into the gap and the drawer clicked open. Inside lay a folded document, thick parchment, old and cracked with age, its edges frayed. Holmes opened it with great care. "What is it?" I asked, stepping close. "An original charter of inheritance," he said grimly. "In Hindi, sealed with the royal emblem of Ranipur, and dated 15 years ago." He read silently for a moment longer, then said, This changes everything." Before I could ask how, the front door opened downstairs. We both turned as footsteps approached. A moment later, Estelle Carmichael entered the room, drawing up short as she saw us standing over her writing desk. She was younger than I expected, no more than 30, with striking grey eyes and a face of refined elegance. Her coat was unbuttoned, a letter still clutched in one gloved hand. For a breath she said nothing. "Miss Carmichael," Holmes said evenly, "but please sit. We have no interest in shaming you, but time is now our enemy. And your silence may cost lives." She looked between us at the charter on the desk and then slowly crossed the room to the sofa. "I wondered," she said, voice quiet but steady, "when someone would come asking about the clock." Holmes remained standing. "You knew about the chimes?" 3 months passed. Colonel brought it in because it lost 5 minutes a week. Tiny adjustment to the escapement and a new mainspring. Not a common size, had to fit it myself. "Did you return it personally?" "No, I sent it by courier." Holmes's fingers drummed once on the wood. "That courier would not by any chance be named Cadwell?" Griggs blinked. "Yes, Robert Cadwell. He's done odd jobs for me for years. Trustworthy lad." Holmes looked satisfied but continued, "I wonder, Mr. Griggs, might I inspect the workshop?" "I won't touch a thing." The old man hesitated, then nodded. "Through there. Mind the bits." We entered the rear chamber, Holmes immediately moving to a high workbench littered with gears, lenses, and tiny tools more suited to surgery than timepieces. He knelt, inspecting a set of clock faces that had been recently lacquered, and then turned toward a metal filing cabinet. Without opening it, he pressed a hand flat against the surface and frowned. "Warm," he murmured. "The sun hasn't touched this side of the building yet. Something was stored here not long ago." He turned abruptly and returned to the main room. "Mr. Griggs, do you keep delivery records?" "Of course." "Then please show me the entry for the Addleton clock." The old man retrieved a thick ledger, thumbing through pages until he found the appropriate date. "Here, August 2nd. Delivery via R. Cadwell, client signature A. Addleton." All in order. Holmes leaned in. "And the signature? Did you compare it to any prior entries?" "Didn't need to." "Looked fine." Holmes tapped the page gently. "But it isn't. Colonel Addleton's A is never formed with a loop. He signs like a man etching stone. This is forged, and by someone with a steady, practiced hand." Griggs stared at the page. But why?" "Because someone intercepted that clock, opened it and returned it with an addition, one not meant to be noticed." Holmes paused. "I suspect the chime mechanism was subtly altered to add a 13th strike. Not as a malfunction, but as a cue, an engineered anomaly. Watson, standing just behind, could no longer contain himself. But to what end, Holmes? Who goes to such trouble simply to make a clock chime falsely?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "To provoke, to signal. The false chime was never meant as a warning. It was a sign, an arranged noise intended to mark a time. Something or someone was meant to move or act upon hearing it." He turned to Griggs again. "Where might I find Mr. Cadwell?" "Likely at the Red Fox Inn. Just off Drury Lane, he lodges above it." Without another word, Holmes was out the door, I trailing close behind. The Red Fox Inn was a battered old tavern with low ceilings and an unremarkable exterior. But the barkeep proved helpful, and within minutes we were ascending a narrow stairway to the lodgings above. Holmes knocked twice, then pushed open the door, which had been left ajar. The room was sparse, bed, desk, a few possessions, but what caught our attention immediately was the man slumped in the corner chair. Robert Cadwell, unmistakably, from the delivery signature matched against Colonel Addleton's letters. His head lolled to the side, a faint trickle of blood at his temple. Watson rushed forward. "Alive, barely. He's been struck. Blunt instrument. Perhaps an hour ago." Holmes was already scanning the room. On the desk was a small ledger and a sealed envelope. He opened the ledger and read a few entries before stopping cold. He handed it to me. The most recent note read 13th chime. Unlocks the rose. Payment due after second trigger. Beware the woman's study. Holmes took the sealed envelope, tore it open and unfolded a piece of parchment, on which were sketched floor plans, schematics of the Addleton household, with several rooms marked in red ink. The study, the bedroom upstairs, and curiously, a small closet near the servants' quarters. A map for a thief, Holmes said grimly. But the theft was never the goal. Cadwell was used. He did not know what he delivered. But someone else, someone clever, made him a pawn. Watson looked up. Then he was silenced. Not quite. Not yet. He's alive, Watson. And if he can speak, he may give us a name. We waited until the constables arrived and the physician took over, leaving Cadwell in care. As we stepped outside once more into the greying morning light, Holmes looked toward the pale sun breaking through the clouds. I suspect the second trigger is imminent, he muttered. The first chiming opened something or signaled someone. Now we must discover what the rose is. A name, a place. Or perhaps, Watson, a secret buried in time. He hailed a cab with urgency. To Richmond Hill. We have unfinished business in the house of the Colonel, before the 13th chime strikes again. The cab rattled through the cobbled streets of London as the morning deepened, grey light filtering through the thick clouds above. Holmes sat in rigid silence beside me, his fingers twitching slightly against the polished head of his walking stick. I knew better than to interrupt him in such a state. This was not mere abstraction, but the fierce internal churning of his deductive engine. Every chime, every clue, every false lead was being reassembled into some new configuration, and I could sense, with the instinct that years at his side had honed in me, that we were closing in on a deeper truth. As we drew once more into Everton Crescent, I could see Colonel Addleton waiting outside his home, his tall frame tense with unease. He greeted us quickly, ushering us inside before we could ask any questions. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you've returned sooner than I expected. Is something the matter?" Holmes did not answer at once. He moved past the Colonel and into the house, his gaze sweeping the hall and landing on a small door recessed into the panelling near the servants' corridor. "That closet," Holmes said quietly. "Who uses it?" "Mostly the housekeeper," Addleton replied. "Cleaning supplies, old curtains, that sort of thing." "Why?" But Holmes was already moving. He opened the door and knelt, producing a small lantern from his coat. Inside the cramped, dusty space, he ran a hand along the rear panel, knocking softly at intervals until he paused and pressed firmly against one particular knot in the wood. With a soft groan, the back of the closet swung inward by a few inches. "A false panel," Holmes muttered. "And recently used." He pulled it open fully, revealing a narrow passage no more than 3 feet deep. At its end stood a small iron box, the sort once used to store ledgers or private papers. The lock had been broken and inside was nothing. Holmes examined the edges of the box carefully. Scratches around the interior. Something was hastily removed. And within the past 48 hours. Likely last night after the chimes, Addleton leaned in. "But who could have—" "Someone with a key to the servants' wing," Holmes said. "Someone who could move unseen between upstairs and down. Someone who knew where to strike and when." He stepped back into the hallway. "Tell me, Colonel, your wife's study. Was it her sanctuary alone?" "Very much so. She kept her journals there, wrote letters, conducted all her affairs from that room. I have rarely entered it myself." "Did she entertain visitors there?" "Occasionally, friends, a cousin, and sometimes my solicitor's clerk when she managed our correspondence." Holmes turned sharply. "A cousin?" "Yes, Estelle Carmichael. A distant relation, from my wife's mother's side. She stayed with us briefly last spring." "I'd almost forgotten. Where is she now?" "Never. It was always precise to the minute." Holmes turned the clock slowly, examining its casing and mechanism. "There's no evidence of tampering with the casing, and the hands have not been forced." He stood and glanced around the room. "The photograph that was shattered, where did it stand?" "On the desk there, beside the inkwell." Holmes approached the desk, which stood in front of the large bay window. The glass had since been cleared, but a faint residue of powder still lingered on the wood. Holmes examined the desk drawers one by one, his movements calm and assured. "This drawer was locked, you said?" he asked. "Yes," Addleton replied. "I had it secured after my wife passed." "I have the key." Yet last night it was open, indeed, and I know for certain it had not been disturbed until then. Inside was nothing of interest, some old correspondence, half-filled notebooks, a theatre program from some years ago. Do you have the valet and the housekeeper available? I do. Shall I summon them? If you please. While the colonel rang for the staff, Holmes turned to me. You notice, Watson, the thin scoring around the drawer's edge? That is no amateur attempt. It was opened without the key by someone who knew their way around a lock. Surely a thief, then, I offered. Perhaps, but tell me, what thief enters to steal nothing, disturbs nothing else, and leaves behind a chiming enigma? Before I could respond, the door opened and two servants stepped in. A gaunt man in his 50s with a grave expression, and a woman of similar age whose starched apron gave her a rigid appearance. This is Hargrove, Addleton said, indicating the man, and Mrs. Bletchley, our housekeeper. Holmes addressed them with a cordial nod. Thank you for joining us. Hargrove, you wind the clock in the study. Yes, sir. Every Saturday morning without fail. It's part of the household routine. Did you notice anything unusual with it this past week? The man hesitated, then shook his head. No, sir. It wound as smooth as ever. I always give the mechanism a quarter turn past tension, as the colonel instructed. And have you ever heard it chime unusually? He nodded now. Yes, sir. Night before last. I'd just finished putting the decanters in order when it began. I heard it clear as anything. 13 chimes. Counted each one. Mrs. Bletchley spoke up. I heard it too, sir. Thought I was going mad. I haven't checked the drawing-room clock to be sure it wasn't a trick of the ears. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Was anything else disturbed that night? The two looked at one another. Well, Mrs. Bletchley said, my keys were missing the next morning. The ring I keep for the lesser locks. Linen cupboard, wine cellar, even the study drawers. Thought I'd misplaced them, but found them in the coal scuttle come afternoon. Didn't think to mention it. That, Holmes said quietly, is precisely why people like you are so valuable. You assume little things are of no account, but they are precisely what make a case intelligible. With the staff dismissed, Holmes requested we remain for dinner, to which Colonel Addleton agreed after some initial protest. The house, he insisted, had felt unnerved of late, as though the clock were merely a symptom of something deeper. That night, as the clock drew near 1, Holmes stationed himself by the study door, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on the marble timepiece. I sat beside him, notebook in hand, struggling to quell the inexplicable chill that had come over me. 1 o'clock struck. A single chime rang out, low, reverberant, then a second, a third. By the time we reached the 12th, the house was silent save for the slow, unnatural rhythm of the clock. 13, it struck, and at that instant, from upstairs, there came a sound, a faint click and the unmistakable creak of an opening door. Holmes was up in a flash, darting from the study like a bullet. I followed, my heart thudding against my ribs as we ascended the staircase. He led us to a narrow passage outside the late Mrs. Addleton's old bedroom. A single gas lamp flickered there, and beneath it, standing ajar, was the door we had just heard. Holmes reached forward and pushed it open. The room inside was untouched, airless, still dressed in the faded elegance of its former occupant. But on the dressing table, beside a vase of long-dead roses, was a curious object, a torn envelope recently handled, and inside it a slip of paper bearing a single, chilling line, "Ask not who strikes the hour, but who resets the time." Holmes held it to the light, frowning. "Well, Watson," he murmured, "we are not dealing with a spirit. We are dealing with a message, and the sender wishes to unsettle, not to haunt." He turned slowly. "And I believe our next visit must be to the clockmaker." We departed Everton Crescent shortly after dawn, the mist of early morning weaving silently through the deserted London streets as our hansom cab clattered toward Covent Garden. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet during the ride, his hands clasped tightly, eyes half-lidded in contemplation. He had scarcely spoken a word since we left the Addleton residence, save for a brief request to see if the note smelled of oil, which I confirmed faintly, before he tucked the torn envelope into his coat pocket with an approving grunt. Our destination was Griggs and Pendle, a narrow, almost hidden establishment off Tavistock Street, a shop that one might easily overlook, were it not for the curious ticking chorus that filtered through the door like the hum of bees in a sunlit orchard. Inside, clocks of every make and age lined the walls and shelves. Carriage clocks. Long case clocks, marine chronometers and delicate French gilt models resting on velvet cushions. A stooped man emerged from behind the counter, his spectacles hanging from a chain that seemed too delicate for the weight they bore. He wore a thick brown apron streaked with brass dust and smelled faintly of oil and varnish. "Good morning," Holmes said smoothly, removing his hat. "I believe you are Mr. Griggs?" "I am," the man replied, eyeing us with mild suspicion. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We come on behalf of Colonel Archibald Addleton. You maintained a carriage clock belonging to his late wife." Griggs squinted. Yes. A lovely piece. Sevres porcelain, Louis XVII style. A gift from a Maharaja, he told me. Very temperamental at first, but she ran smooth as silk once I got her tuned. "Tell me," Holmes said, stepping nearer the counter, "when did you last handle it?"